Look back into the age of Edmund Burke in the 18th century and look at some of the difficulties that he perceived within the British constitutional system in that era, because this will show us how a great mind such as Burke is able to perceive deeper problems, structural problems within a constitution that we need to be able to perceive in our own system today. We at Modern Age like to be daring, and this week we have a particularly bold episode because we're going to bring together some thinking about Donald Trump and American constitutionalism today with perspectives drawn from Edmund Burke, the great 18th century statesman who is the founding father of conservatism on both sides of the Atlantic. Edmund Burke had brilliant insights into the British Constitution of his own day, and those insights are actually applicable to our own circumstances in the 21st century in America, despite all the differences between, on the one hand, a monarchical constitution in the case of Britain in the 18th century, and the Republican constitution that we have in America today. Now, it's been 10 years since President Trump came down that famous escalator, and it's been 6 months since Donald Trump has resumed the Oval Office in his second term. And Donald Trump has clearly brought about a number of dramatic changes to American policy, American politics, even the very shape of government in terms of firing officials who were not doing good jobs, in terms of shutting down whole departments and agencies, and really challenging the way government in Washington has been run ever since the New Deal, basically. Now, this has created a tremendous amount of resistance, of course, not just among Democrats and liberals and progressives, but there are even certain kinds of conservatives who are unhappy with President Trump and who think that he goes too far. They think that, yes, perhaps they would like to see, National Public Radio defunded, or they would like to see USAID defunded, but they think that Donald Trump has to go through the proper channels, and he's not doing that. Instead, he is perhaps circumventing Congress and is acting with too much presidential authority. And really, these conservatives believe that Congress should be taking the lead on all of these issues. Beyond that, there is a fear among certain conservatives who are worried about Donald Trump going too far, that Trump is not perhaps respectful enough of expertise in general, that he is taking a heavy hand towards American institutions outside of government, including not only the media, but particularly higher education. So there are conservative institutionalists, many of them affiliated with the American Enterprise Institute, who are very worried about the direction that Donald Trump is going in. Some of these people would perhaps be described as never-Trumpers, but others are perhaps, willing to vote for Donald Trump. Maybe they voted for him in 2016 or 2020 or 2024, but nevertheless, they are still concerned that his approach to government is a little too strong. Well, I think one way we can gain a perspective on what Trump is doing is to look not at our own era with its own controversies and the thickets that we get into when we try to, take on controversial subjects that we are all familiar with and that are immediately in front of us, but rather look back at some of the controversies of another country in another age. Look back into the age of Edmund Burke in the 18th century and look at some of the difficulties that he was facing and that he perceived within the British constitutional system in that era, because this will show us how a great mind such as Burke is able to perceive deeper problems, structural problems within a constitution that we need to be able to perceive in our own system today. So Burke is in not only the 18th century, but in particular, he is an advisor to the Marquis of Rockingham, who's one of the leaders of the Whig Party in the mid to late 18th century. And it's after 1760 that George III comes to the throne and becomes King of England. Now, of course, George III is infamous to Americans because he's the king against whom we revolt, and we have the American Revolution, and we declare our independence. But Edmund Burke, even before he became actually a supporter of the American cause, he certainly thought that the Americans were right to complain about their ill treatment by Parliament and by George III. Even before that, however, Edmund Burke, who goes on to become the leading light of the conservative mind in the 18th century and really through to today. His book, Reflections on the Revolution in France, is in some respects the political Bible of conservatives, both then and now. But even before all of that, in the 1760s, Edmund Burke is concerned about a malign influence in the British Constitution. And this has to be explained in a couple of steps. Today we think of the British Constitution as being a so-called constitutional monarchy, And in practice, Parliament has almost all the power, and the king has a largely symbolic role. But back in the 18th century, this was not yet really the case. It was true that Parliament was much more powerful than the king in the 18th century, but the king still had a very active role in choosing his ministers, including the prime minister. The king had a freer hand then than he has today. And what this meant is that if the king wanted to use his influence, if he wanted to use his power to pick his ministers, to pick his prime minister, for example, if he also wanted to use his powers to award knighthoods and titles of nobility, and to award pensions and other kinds of emoluments and benefits to supporters, he could try to use all of these resources to turn Parliament against itself. So that if, for example, the Whig Party won parliamentary elections, the king could say, well, you know what? I'm going to choose which Whig I want to be my prime minister. I'm going to choose a Whig who is basically going to be subservient to me as the king. And I'm going to use the riches of my royal treasury, and I'm going to use my ability to give honors and knighthoods and noble titles in order to suborn members of parliament to be loyal to me, the king, as the executive, rather than being loyal to themselves within the parliament and within the legislative branch. Now, Edmund Burke saw himself, even though the Whig Party was the party in power, it had many different factions, and Edmund Burke saw himself as being part of an opposition faction. These were called the Rockingham Whigs. And Burke was very concerned about this abuse of royal power in order to concentrate authority within the circle of the court, within not just the king himself, but within the circuit of the king's closest friends in Parliament. So again, it was kind of a collaboration between the king and certain members of Parliament, even certain members of the Whig Party, to subordinate Parliament as a whole to the court. It's weakening the power of the country, as Burke saw it, and strengthening the power of the court, the insiders, instead. Now, Edmund Burke's perspective is not necessarily the 100% correct perspective. There were certainly Tories, and they didn't really have a formal party at this point in the 1760s, but they did have a point of view that was quite well distinguished, and they did have a philosophy, which is expressed by everyone from Viscount Bolingbroke through to Samuel Johnson. The Tories thought that it was in fact the Whigs who represented the real threat to the British Constitution, because the Tories said, well, you know what? The Whigs say that all the power should be in Parliament. They want to trivialize the king. They want to concentrate power not only in Parliament, but within the Whig Party, within the Whig majority in Parliament itself. In other words, this is government not by king and Parliament together, which is the theory on which the Glorious Revolution of 1688 was based. Instead, it is simply a kind of oligarchy of Whigs who are running the country simply as a self-interested party. So the Tories tended to be very critical of partisanship and very critical, of course, of the Whig Party in particular. And the Tories tended to present themselves as being a party, ironically enough, of the entire country. Now you can see that, obviously, both parties, the Whigs and the Tories, think of themselves as having a higher purpose. They're not simply serving themselves. They're not simply out to win elections, but they see themselves as real defenders of the Constitution of Britain, even though they have markedly different understandings of how that Constitution works. From the Whig perspective, as laid out by Edmund Burke, the risk to the Constitution is that the court is gaining too much power by mixing together the powers of the king and of his cronies, his friends within Parliament. Whereas from the perspective of the Tories, the danger is that too much power is going to be co-opted by the Whig Party within Parliament, and that it's going to sideline the king. Now, as history works out, it turns out that Parliament does indeed concentrate power, and the king does indeed become sidelined and is less of a factor in British constitutionalism today. Instead, almost all power rests within Parliament, and the party that has a majority in Parliament has pretty much carte blanche within the British Constitution and is almost all-powerful. Now, one of the interesting aspects of Edmund Burke's view of the British Constitution is that he had a kind of implicit federalism to his thought. Now, we Americans have a formal federalism within our Constitution. We have actual states that have governments of their own. These states have cultures of their own. They have political orientations of their own. We know that some states are red, some states are blue, and even within those Republican and Democratic divisions, there are different varieties of Republican and different varieties of Democrat among the various states. Well, Britain didn't have quite such a strong localized federalist system. It certainly did have constituencies, but geography doesn't have quite the same sway within England and Britain as a whole as it does in America's form of federalism. Instead, what Edmund Burke saw as being what we Americans might call a kind of federalist element within the British Constitution were the great landowners, the great families. These are the aristocracy. And Burke saw the aristocracy, the great landowning families, as being a counterweight within the Constitution, a kind of check and balance upon the king, and also as a balance upon the more volatile elements within the British public. So the great Whig aristocracy, which owned huge tracts of land, if you've ever seen the television show Downton Abbey, in a small way it conveys something of what it's like to be a large British landowner. So you have a massive estate. This estate employs a great many people. And so you have a kind of it's almost like you are a state government unto yourself. You're not quite as big as a U.S. state government, but you as a great British aristocratic landowner have a huge amount of people who are answerable to you in terms of their employment, in terms of your serving as the local authority for various kinds of government projects. You as a great Whig magnate, a great aristocratic landowner, have an enormous amount of authority, again, which in some ways is a little bit parallel to the authority of the states within the American Constitution. So Burke thought that these great landowners, these powerful aristocrats, would on the one hand be capable of balancing the monarchical, monopolistic power of the king, while also being able to modulate the authority of the people. So Burke, at this point in the 1760s, was very much in some respects, a small d Democrat, a supporter of the popular element of the British Constitution. He thought it was of the utmost importance that the British people were able to elect their own representatives to Parliament. But he thought those representatives should be chosen from among the great Whig leaders, the great aristocratic landowners. So this too has some parallels with the way our founding fathers thought about the American Constitution. Our founding fathers thought that people within congressional districts and within the states, of course, at the beginning, it's state governments that elect U.S. senators, but nevertheless, that is a filter system that allows popular judgments, which are electing people to state government. Popular elections ultimately have a sway upon the selection of U.S. senators because, of course, state legislators who are picking U.S. senators are themselves elected by the people of their states. So the American system is predicated on the people's authority, the people's sovereignty. But the Founding Fathers expected this to be modulated through great and respectable leaders, people who either were owners of large tracts of land, as indeed George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were, people who had legal educations, such as John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. So you had a kind of natural aristocracy, as Jefferson called it, which also had a conventional kind of aristocratic background as well. These were people who had, families that had been notable for several generations. They had training as lawyers. These were people who had read the great Greek and Latin classics. So you had this aristocracy both of talent, naturally speaking, and also of position within society, who would just automatically be the people that American voters would select to be their leaders. In Britain, you didn't have, in the 18th century, the same sort of geography being represented as you have in America, but you did have these powerful Whig leaders who Edmund Burke thought would be naturally chosen by British voters as their leaders, who would then, both be able to tutor the people, give the people a sense of what it's like to be a self-governing subject, basically, while also being able to get the best out of the king and make sure that the king's power did not become excessive and that cronies around the king were not co-opting power within Britain. Now, here's the thought that had occurred to me, and which is something I've explored in an essay for The American Mind, which is a publication of our friends at the Claremont Institute. There's a sense in which America also has the kind of informal federalism the same kind of power structure that Edmund Burke saw in the British Constitution back in the 18th century. So in other words, just because we have a formal kind of federalism and we have states, doesn't mean that we don't also have this informal kind of federalism where very powerful individuals or very powerful institutions are also elements that are kind of part of the informal constitution of our country. In other words, they're not part of the document that was written by James Madison and others at the Constitutional Convention, but rather these are elements that are extremely powerful in our society that in fact do have a tremendous sway in politics. They are institutions such as our law schools, for example, such as our media. These are institutions that not only shape public opinion, but that also shape our leadership class in this country as well. And that includes higher education as well as the law schools. It includes a whole variety of elite institutions. These institutions are also, in a sense, a kind of constitution unto themselves. And they are a constitution outside of the political constitution. They're outside of the formal constitution. They are instead an informal realm of power and authority. And yet, the power they wield is no less strong simply because they are outside of the formal constitution. So the informal constitution is still something that has a tremendous effect both on the formal constitution and on the lives of ordinary Americans. Now, Edmund Burke in the 18th century had pointed to the way in which the Whig Party and its landowning aristocrats could in fact be a balance both towards the people but also towards the king, and could really keep the British Constitution in good shape. In America, what's happened, unfortunately, is that our own formal constitution, the written constitution, which has, again, a popular basis fundamentally, this has been hijacked by the informal constitution, which consists of the elite institutions of our society. And in America, of course, we don't have these great landowning aristocrats. Even in the time of the American founding fathers, when you did have southern plantation owners and others who had vast estates, it was not quite the same as the British class system, where you had these Whig magnates, these formal aristocrats with their massive estates. But today, of course, we not only don't have the formal aristocracy, we also do not have the kind of vast plantation landowners that you had in the era of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. What we have instead, however, are these institutions. You have Harvard University with its endowment of more than $50 billion. You have, institutions like our major national newspaper and television networks and radio and others, which have an enormous ability to shape public perception and to shape public opinion. And of course, if you're able to shape perceptions and opinions, you're then able to shape voter behavior to some extent and really influence elections and government. So there's a tremendous amount of power in the informal constitution and these informal institutions of our society. And these institutions, I think, have a very aristocratic mindset. And this is one of the things that some remarks by Yuval Levin, a brilliant intellectual at the American Enterprise Institute, got me thinking about, because I recently attended a panel at AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, where Yuval Levin, Jonah Goldberg, Matthew Continetti, and Ramesh Ponnuru were discussing the legacy of William F. Buckley Jr. And during his remarks, Yuval Levin happened to criticize conservatives who think of America as being a kind of dustbin on fire, a kind of a dumpster fire that needs to be put out. And Yuval Levin was saying this is a much too pessimistic view of America. And that got me thinking that, in fact, conservatives, especially those who support Donald Trump, they don't think of America as being a dumpster fire. They think of our elites as being a dumpster fire. They think of our institutions of great authority outside of government as being a dumpster fire. And they also think of the deep state within government, the administrative state, as being a dumpster fire, to use this image that was inspired by Yuval Levin at this panel. All of this I started to put together for an article in The American Mind, which again is a publication of our friends at the Claremont Institute. And I thought to myself, well, you know what? What Trump has done, what Trump has accomplished in the 10 years since he came down that escalator, is to restore the formal American Constitution, the actual small d democratic constitution that puts authority and power in the hands of the people. Trump has restored that by taking on and, in fact, shunning and locking out of power many of these aristocratic institutions, the universities, the established media, and other kinds of prestige organizations, which have been a kind of informal constitution that has been ruling us without our permission. So we had a revolution in this country back in the 1770s and 1780s in order to overthrow British power and to have a self-governing people here in America. But what's happened, especially since the 1930s, especially since the formalization of so much power, not only in Washington, D.C., but also within these great, powerful national institutions that are outside of government and that are able to shape opinion among both the elite and the people, is that we have switched from a small d democratic and popular system, admittedly a system that has many checks and balances. It's not a pure democracy, it's instead a popular republic, but nevertheless a system that is based in the people. We've switched from that to a system that is increasingly based on the opinion molders, the elite, basically a kind of false aristocracy within this country, which doesn't have noble titles, which doesn't necessarily own vast tracts of land, but instead has privileged positions within our universities, our media, our think tanks, and so forth. The power wielded by this aristocracy in America is monolithic, and it has created a kind of uniparty that actually encompasses both of the formal political parties. Before Trump came along, both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party agreed on such a wide variety of issues that in fact should have been matters for public debate and should have been matters for the people to have a discussion about before America's government was making decisions about them. This includes matters of war and peace. It includes, a question of whether we are going to be a kind of police force for the entire planet or whether we're going to have a foreign policy that puts America first. It includes questions of immigration, whether America should be a de facto open borders country where we let in an enormous amount of illegal immigrants and we never enforce the immigration laws, or whether we should be a country that in fact polices its borders and restricts citizenship according to the rules of the Constitution. And similarly, we should think about everything from whether the American people as voters in their own states should be the ones making laws about abortion, or whether we think that the Supreme Court has the authority to impose a pro-abortion view on the entire country with a law like Roe v. Wade. All of these things were decided upon by elites, not just within the Democratic Party, but also in many cases in the Republican Party and throughout the great influential institutions outside of government. There was a monolithic point of view on most of these questions, and they were not being debated. They were not, the full range of the American people's opinions was not being expressed. Instead, the elite was simply a kind of closed circle that was going in the direction it chose to go in. Donald Trump has opened that up. Donald Trump has restored the American people's voice. That doesn't mean that everything that Trump does necessarily is popular and always has overwhelming public support, but he has broken the monopoly that the aristocracy had on American politics for, 2 generations basically in America, and certainly a monopoly that had become extremely constrictive after the end of the Cold War in 1989. Now, you can have a kind of informal aristocracy in a country that could be doing very good work and that could in fact be serving the public. But in order for an informal aristocracy to serve the public has to have enough power that it can basically afford to say no to the aristocracy and afford to tell the aristocracy what its own interests and its own beliefs and its own choice about the direction of the country is. And then the aristocracy and the people, the democracy, can have a properly sort of mixed relationship where they debate and discuss where they're going to go, what the people are willing to do, and what the aristocracy or the elite advises that the country do. If you exclude the people from those conversations, if you just have a conversation among the elites and among the aristocracy, you wind up with policies that do not have sufficient popular support, so that even if they're good policies, they wind up failing. But not only that, you wind up with a lot of bad policies because, in fact, the American people are usually the best judge of good policies and not the American elite. So even though Edmund Burke, back in the 18th century, provides an account of how you can have, in his case, a formal elite, people who are actually landowning aristocrats who can balance the Constitution and make the country better, Here in America, we have an informal elite, an informal aristocracy that has been corrupted for a long time, that has wielded monopolistic power within our institutions, and that use that power as leverage upon American politics to the detriment of the actual democratic element of our Constitution. And of course, our Constitution, while it is full of checks and balances, and it certainly is designed to create to draw out the very best elements of popular opinion, it is fundamentally based on the sovereignty of the American people themselves. And if you get away from that, if instead you have an aristocracy that believes it is detached from the American people and can make the choices about the ship of state and its direction without consulting the people, or by turning the people into simply a rubber stamp within elections where they have a choice between two candidates who really have very few differences between them, like Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, then you wind up with a system that is not what our founding fathers designed, a system that is in fact a complete inversion and corruption of what our revolution was fought for back in the 1770s and 1780s. So Donald Trump, again, for all of the controversies that he may be involved in, has actually restored a sense of the dynamism of America, a sense of our real Constitution, its democratic basis, and also the productive strife, the productive interplay between the elite and the people, where the people have the ultimate say and the people have the ultimate power. And the elite certainly play an important role, but they should not have a role that is that of an aristocracy, which is certainly not what our founding fathers wanted. Our founding fathers wanted a natural aristocracy that would be chosen freely by the people, but they did not think that an aristocracy should divorce itself from the people and should become a self-perpetuating elite, which is what our institutions in general have created in this country, and Donald Trump is now helping to creatively destroy.